As a frontier settlement, there wasn't always hope that Caughnawaga would last. Given time, people, and resources, however, it became the town we know today as Meadville. But what was the path that led to this transformation? David Mead was born in Hudson, New York on January 17, 1752. He was the eldest son of Darius and Ruth Curtis Mead of Connecticut. In 1774, he married Agnes Wilson of Northumberland County, Pennsylvania, and the couple had 9 children, of whom 5 lived to maturity. Land disputes between Pennsylvania and Connecticut forced Mead into moving to Sunbury, PA, where he operated an inn and a distillery, both of which prospered. After the Revolutionary War, they returned to land they previously owned in nearby Wyoming, PA, and used all they had accumulated to improve that property. However, disputes over who owned the property became so menacing that they were forced to flee back to Sunbury with only a meager portion of their possessions and without the money to rebuild their formerly profitable businesses. When he learned about new land opportunities in northwestern Pennsylvania, David and his brother John traveled to the area. Liking what they saw, they led a group of 9 men to the French Creek Valley in the spring of 1788 and set up camp where they built a double log cabin and planted corn. Land in the area had been previously cleared, and the building also had the advantage of being one day's travel by boat from the nearby Fort Franklin. The men traveled back east to return to their families, with David and John bringing their families west once more for the winter. This settlement was first known as Caughnawaga. A few new settlers arrived in 1789, including David's parents. David's wife Agnes gave birth to a baby named Sarah, who became the first child of European descent born in what is now Crawford County. That year, David built a sawmill down near the creek in a deep ravine. He eventually expanded this to add a grist mill, which is a mill for grinding grain. This was to continue attracting settlers, since encouraging growth ensured the very survival of this settlement. Trouble wasn't far away, though. While some of the neighboring Native American tribes, such as the Iroquois and Lenape, were friendly, others proved to be hostile. Fighting began in 1791, when a settler was killed while trying to plant corn. The settlers all fled to Fort Franklin, where David's father was later killed. In 1792, with help from the fort, David returned to Caughnawaga and built a stockade around his compound. Later that fall, a blockhouse was added, which projected over French Creek, built with the help of men sent up from the fort. These measures slowed the number of settlers leaving, and may even have encouraged others to come. All field work was done only by armed parties to guarantee their safety. Despite a treaty ending the Northwest Indian War in 1794, no settlers moved west of French Creek until 1795. This was also the year that Meadville completed its first school, with 12 students beginning their education led by teacher Janet Finney. Unfortunately for David, even these 2 years of easing tensions had been difficult. In 1794, his mother's death was the first natural death in the settlement, and his wife Agnes passed away the following year during childbirth. His fortunes improved the following year, however. He contracted with William Dick for the settlement's first frame house, and he married schoolteacher Janet Finney, who bore him 6 more children, of which 5 survived, making him the father of 15 children overall. That 1797 house still survives, albeit having been drastically remodeled twice. Another accomplishment of his included serving as a justice of the peace until Crawford County was carved from Allegheny County, when he became an associate county judge. During the War of 1812, he was appointed Major General to command the state's 16th Military Division, of which Crawford County was a part. During the war, he responded to Oliver Hazard Perry's call for support in creating a fleet of ships at Presque Isle to face the British fleet, resulting in victory during the Battle of Lake Erie. 2 years later, on a warm June 20th, 1815 evening, David participated in another historic event at the log courthouse on Diamond Park. Timothy Alden met with the town's leaders and David to found Allegheny College. Though this would be his last involvement in a major community milestone, it was an appropriate climax for one who, ever since 1798, had fostered and generously contributed to making education accessible to the area's settlers. David Mead passed away on August 23, 1816, at the age of 65. He had lived a full life to see his small settlement turn into a thriving community. Before settlers moved into northwestern Pennsylvania, almost the entire area was covered with forests, with only a few cabins or cleared plots of land. French Creek was easily the most notable landmark. These forests were full of deer, wild turkey, rabbits, bears, wolves, lynx or wildcats, beaver, raccoons, foxes, and rattlesnakes. Wild berries and some nuts and greens were available for travelers to eat on their journey. When a family like David Mead's would travel west to settle new land, families would travel on horseback with mules or pack horses to carry their belongings, as the trails at that time were too narrow for wagons. They also had some rivers to cross and might use rafts or ferry crossing. It probably took them many weeks to make this trip, while today we can drive this distance in 5 hours. Due to the difficulty of traveling, these settlers would only travel with what was necessary to live. They knew this would be the only settlement north of Pittsburgh and west of the Allegheny Mountains. They brought metal tools for gardening and woodworking, rifles, cooking utensils, a candle mold, a lantern, bedding, clothing, a spinning wheel, and a few prized possessions like the family Bible, a clock, and a mirror. Furniture would not likely be transported because this could easily be built at a new settlement. Animals like cows, chickens, and sheep were often brought along as well. A cabin like this one could be erected by a group of men in a few days. Mud and straw would seal the gaps between the logs to keep the cabin warm during winter. Fireplaces were built on the outside to alleviate the danger of burning the cabin down, and small windows prevented intruders from climbing in. Candles made from animal fat or oil lamps would provide lighting, since electricity would not have been invented yet. Children would have several chores. Boys chopped and carried wood, prepared the fields for gardening, carried water from the creek to the cabin, and helped their fathers to fish and shoot game. Girls helped their mothers to prepare and cook food, clean and spin flax to make linen cloth, and learn how to make the cloth into clothes. They also helped to make soap and candles, as well as take care of younger children and babies. Meals consisted of a lot of corn, consumed both as corn mush as well as cornbread, which was sometimes called journey cakes. Families would raise some vegetables that they could store in the ground for winter use. They would have fish from the creeks and deer, rabbits, and turkey to hunt. Their cows would give them milk, and they could then make butter. Honey and maple were used for sweetening food, and nuts and berries provided additional variety. Without grocery stores, though, families would have to travel all the way to Fort Venango or Pittsburgh to buy an ingredient like salt.
Meadville was founded in 1788. The area was rough frontier and had no school for several years. The first school teacher, a young woman named Jeanette Finney, arrived in 1794 just as winter was coming on. The school hadn't yet been built, so she found an empty cabin near French Creek and moved into it. Now, that cabin had been built earlier that year by a settler named William Gill. He raised corn there over the summer and then went to Pittsburgh in the fall to get supplies and bring his family back. Severe winter weather came early, though, so Gill wasn't able to return until the following spring. Jeanette Finney met him at the door with a rifle in her hands. She told him that she had claimed that land through squatters' rights, and that if he didn't leave, she'd put a bullet through him. Mr. Gill decided to abandon his claim and settle further up French Creek. Jeanette opened the first school later that spring. It was a log cabin on 2nd Street, which is called Market Street today. Around that time, David Mead's wife, Agnes, died. It seems that Miss Finney could woo as well as teach and shoot. where she and David were married in 1797. They went on to have 6 children. Their daughter, Maria, eventually inherited the old squatter cabin, and, in a strange twist of fate, she married one of William Gill's sons, thus ending the old land dispute for good. Let's imagine now what that early school was like. The cabin could have had wooden pegs on the walls for students to hang on their coats and their lunch pails, and rough wooden benches for them to sit on. The windows were openings covered with oiled paper that let in some light and kept out the insects. Heat came from a wood stove and water from a bucket. The older scholars were expected to chop wood for the stove, fill the water buckets, and keep the schoolroom tidy, as well as help the younger children with their lessons. There were very few books on the frontier, so most studying involved repeating lessons over and over out loud. Some of the children might have had slates to write on, but most had to make do with charcoal and pieces of birch bark, or using a sharp stick to scratch numbers and letters on the dirt floor. The day's lessons always began with a long chapter from the Bible. Students would be called up individually to recite and were expected to begin with a bow. Typically, each child would be asked to recite a lesson about 4 times a day. The rest of the time, the students were required to sit up very straight and study their lessons aloud. Anyone who slouched or fidgeted was punished with a tawse, a leather strap with a slit on one end and a wooden handle on the other. 10 to 12 whippings a day would not have been uncommon.
In 1988, 2 centuries after David Mead's original settlement began, a group of people worked to construct this log cabin for what became known as Kenneth A. Beer's Bicentennial Park. Like the original cabin, it was built with nearby trees by only 9 men, led by Ken, who was the city's engineer at the time. However, it was built a little differently. Instead of the mud and straw to serve as chinking between the logs that David and his men would have used, Ken and his men used cement. Also, you'll note the metal roof on the cabin today does a much better job of keeping the rain out than the original wood-shake shingles, which you can still see above you. The goal was to commemorate the town's founding, to serve as an enduring place for residents to come to understand where their town came from. While an original log cabin of the day would not have lasted more than several years, the work of these men stands as a monument to the tenacity and energy of the original settlers of Meadville.